The sun had just started to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped in the trees, and the soft breeze moved through the leaves. It looked like any ordinary day in the Johnson family's life. Mark and Sarah Johnson had built a peaceful home here, hoping for safety and happiness. Their daughter, Emily, was 12 years old, full of energy, and loved to play outside in the yard. Everything seemed perfect, normal, and calm. Mark walked out to the driveway, sipping his morning coffee. He looked at the neat rows of houses around him. Everything was so quiet. Another normal day, he said to himself. He smiled, thinking about how lucky they were to have such a nice neighborhood. Sarah was inside, preparing breakfast, humming a cheerful tune. Emily ran back and forth in the yard, chasing her dog, Max, who barked happily at her. From the outside, it seemed like a perfect picture. But sometimes, things are not as they seem. Unseen eyes were watching the Johnsons. A small group of neighbors, members of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been keeping a close watch on the family for weeks. They whispered to each other, taking notes, observing every small detail. The Johnsons had no idea that trouble was slowly creeping toward their door. Emily's laughter filled the air, breaking the morning silence. Mark watched her from the driveway and smiled. He had no idea that the world was about to change in ways he could never imagine. Sarah called Emily inside for breakfast, and Emily ran to the kitchen, still laughing. Everything felt safe, comfortable. That morning, the Johnsons thought they were just enjoying another ordinary day. But peace is often fragile. While Mark sipped his coffee, he noticed a car slowly driving past their house. It wasn't unusual to see neighbors driving around, but something about this car felt strange. It moved slowly, almost like it was trying not to be noticed. Two men inside the car seemed to be watching the house carefully. Mark frowned. "That's odd," he muttered. But he didn't want to worry Sarah. He decided to ignore it for now. Inside the house, Sarah set the table for breakfast. She placed plates of eggs, toast, and fresh fruit in front of Emily and Mark. "Eat up," she said. "We have a busy day ahead." Emily chattered about her plans to play with her friends later, completely unaware of the strange car outside. Mark nodded, still thinking about the car. But he tried to focus on the breakfast and the laughter filling the kitchen. The calm of the morning made this sudden threat even more shocking. That sense of safety, that feeling of being in control, was about to be shattered. The HOA members had already made plans to confront the Johnsons. They believed the Johnsons were breaking rules that were often confusing, strict, and sometimes unfair. And now, they wanted to take action. By mid-morning, the Johnsons went about their day, completely unaware of the danger looming nearby. Mark decided to mow the lawn while Emily played in the yard. Sarah watered the flowers, humming a tune to herself. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, and routine. But just a few streets away, the HOA members prepared to make their move. They whispered to each other, checking their papers and taking pictures. Their intentions were clear, and their eyes were filled with a dangerous determination. Emily laughed as she kicked a ball across the yard. Max ran after it, barking happily. "Emily! Don't kick it too far," Mark called, smiling. Emily waved and ran toward the house. Life felt simple, safe, and happy. Little did they know, the calm morning was the last moment of peace they would have for a long time. Mark finished mowing the lawn and put away the mower. He noticed the strange car again, parked a little further down the street this time. This time, he saw the men inside, watching intently. A chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think someone is watching us." Sarah looked up from her flowers, concerned. "Who?" she asked. Mark pointed to the car, but by the time Sarah looked, it was gone. The unease lingered in the air. The family didn't know it yet, but the HOA members had already started plotting. Their plan was bold, aggressive, and shocking. They wanted to make Emily pay for rules she didn't even know she was breaking. They wanted to make the Johnsons feel fear, confusion, and helplessness. And their first step was coming very soon, so soon that the family would have no time to prepare. For now, though, the morning remained calm. Emily ran back to the house, her laughter echoing through the yard. Mark and Sarah exchanged worried glances but tried to keep the peace. "Maybe it's nothing," Mark said, hoping to convince himself as much as Sarah. They didn't know that the storm was just minutes away from breaking through their quiet suburban life. The Johnsons had no idea what was coming. The calm, the laughter, the ordinary morning, it was all about to be shattered. And when it happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Birds were still chirping, but their songs seemed distant now, almost drowned by a feeling in the air, something unusual, almost wrong. Inside the Johnson home, Emily was drawing at the kitchen table, lost in her world of colors. She didn't notice the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing while staring at the house. Mark was in the garage, fixing a squeaky hinge on the back door, while Sarah sorted laundry in the living room. Everything seemed normal, ordinary. But normal was about to be interrupted. A loud, sharp knock at the front door made Emily jump. Her pencil rolled off the table, and Mark and Sarah exchanged quick glances. No one came by without calling first in this neighborhood. Mark wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door. He opened it carefully and froze. Standing there were two men he had seen before, the same ones in the strange car from that morning. Their faces were hard, eyes cold, and their posture aggressive. One of them held a clipboard with papers fluttering in the wind. "Hello," the man said in a voice that was firm, almost threatening. "We need to speak about your daughter." Mark's heart sank. "About Emily?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," the man replied. "She has violated HOA rules. You need to come with us, or there will be consequences." Emily peeked from the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide. "What are they talking about, Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark stepped in front of her protectively. "This is none of your concern, Emily. Stay inside." Sarah moved closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Are they serious?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Mark didn't answer. He could see the determination in their eyes. These weren't people who came just to talk politely, they meant business. The men from the HOA started reading rules and regulations from their clipboard. They claimed Emily had broken certain community rules, things that seemed minor, silly even. But their tone was sharp, aggressive. Mark felt his stomach twist. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Emily hasn't done anything wrong." The men didn't respond with reason, they responded with authority. One of them stepped closer, his shadow falling over the threshold of the house. "Rules are rules. If you refuse to comply, we can take action immediately," he said. Emily clutched the edge of the counter, her small hands trembling. "Dad, what's happening?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Fear had replaced her earlier laughter. Mark's mind raced. These men weren't just angry neighbors. They were using intimidation, and they were willing to push it far. "You're not taking her anywhere," Mark said firmly, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. One of the men smirked. "You don't have a choice. This is the law in our community." Sarah felt her heart pounding. She looked at Mark, silently pleading. Mark nodded slightly. He knew what he had to do. Calm was no longer an option, they had to act. Suddenly, one of the HOA men reached toward Emily. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back instinctively. "Stop!" Mark shouted, stepping in front of her. His anger rose like a wave, protective, fierce, unstoppable. The men hesitated for a moment, just long enough for the tension to thicken. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable. Neighbors walking by on the street stopped and stared, sensing the confrontation. Mark's voice grew louder, commanding. "You are not taking my daughter. Do you understand?" The man with the clipboard glanced at his companion, then back at Mark. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said coldly. Sarah gripped Mark's arm, whispering, "We need help. This isn't just an argument. They're serious." Mark knew she was right. These weren't ordinary troublemakers. They were dangerous, and their threats were real. He turned toward the house and said, "Emily, go inside, lock the door, and stay calm. Mom, do the same. I'll handle this." Inside, Emily and Sarah did as instructed, hearts racing. Through the window, they could see Mark standing firm, facing the men outside. He didn't move an inch. His presence alone was a silent warning, they wouldn't succeed. The HOA men realized this wasn't going to be easy. Their plan to intimidate had encountered resistance. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched across the yard, creating a dark, tense atmosphere. Every second felt heavier than the last, and the danger felt closer, sharper, more real. Mark knew they couldn't fight this alone. These men were not just neighbors, they were armed with rules, threats, and a sense of authority that could ruin their family's peace. He needed backup. He needed someone who could stop this immediately, someone with real power. And that's when he made the call. The phone rang, echoing sharply through the quiet house. Mark's hands shook as he held it, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his chest. On the other end, a calm voice answered, professional yet distant, U.S. Marshals. "How can I help?" Mark's heart pounded. He had never imagined a day like this, calling federal authorities because of neighborhood bullies. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "My daughter, she's being threatened," he said. "By members of the HOA. They tried to," his words caught in his throat. The anger, fear, and helplessness all collided at once. Inside, Sarah paced the kitchen, wringing her hands. Emily sat at the table, staring blankly at her coloring book. But her eyes weren't on the paper, they were on the closed front door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every creak of the floor, every rustle outside made them jump. Mark hung up the phone, taking a deep breath. "They're coming," he said, his voice steady, though his hands still trembled. Emily's small hand found his, gripping it tightly. "Daddy, will they be safe?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, scared, but it was the first time she had admitted fear out loud. Sarah knelt beside her. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay. But we have to stay calm, stay quiet. Don't make any sudden moves." Even as they tried to focus on calm, fear spread through them like wildfire. The HOA men had tried to intimidate Emily, but now the family understood something crucial: they were dealing with people who didn't care about rules, truth, or fairness. Only control and power mattered to them. Mark went to the window and peeked through the blinds. The street seemed quiet. Too quiet. A neighbor's car rolled slowly past, and he could see one of the HOA men standing further down the block, arms crossed, watching. Their eyes met for a moment, and Mark felt the weight of it, a silent warning. They weren't finished. Not yet. Inside, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in with the rising fear. Sarah whispered, "I can't believe this is happening, right here, in our own home." Her voice cracked, revealing the panic she tried to hide. Emily's grip on her mother's hand tightened. She was too young to fully understand, but she felt the danger, the sharp tension that had suddenly entered their lives. Every minute seemed to stretch into an hour. The house, once a place of laughter and comfort, now felt like a trap. Mark took a step back from the window. He had to stay strong. "Listen," he said, "we can't panic. They want us scared. If we stay calm, we take away their power." He could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes, the tremor in her voice, but he knew she would follow his lead. The minutes passed slowly. Every knock, every distant shout of a neighbor, made their hearts jump. Emily whispered questions repeatedly, and Sarah tried to answer, but Mark knew the truth: they had no idea what could happen next. The HOA men had crossed a line, and anything was possible. Finally, a soft rumble in the distance caught their attention. It wasn't the usual car or footsteps, they recognized it instantly. The sound of authority, of power, approaching. Mark motioned for the family to stay away from the windows. "They're here," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him, eyes wide. Are they safe? Emily?" Mark nodded. "Yes, but but we need to stay inside. Just stay calm. Let them handle this. Emily hugged her mother tightly. I don't want them to take me, Daddy, she whispered. Fear dripped from every word. Mark knelt down beside her. No one is taking you, Emily. Not while I'm here. His voice was low, but filled with determination, a promise. The house was silent again. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Outside, footsteps approached, heavier now, steady, deliberate. The air seemed thicker, almost alive with anticipation. Every second stretched, every moment felt like a test. Mark's mind raced. The call to the U.S. Marshals had set a chain of events in motion, but until they arrived, the HOA men could make any move they wanted. The family could only wait, hearts pounding, minds racing, trapped between fear and hope. Emily whispered again, almost to herself, "Why is this happening to us?" Mark looked at her, his face hardening. Because some people like to hurt others to feel powerful. But that's not who we are. And we're not going to let them win. The sound of a car stopping outside shattered the silence. Mark peeked through the blinds, uniformed figures, serious faces, approaching the house. Relief and tension collided inside him. The fight wasn't over yet. But the first step toward safety had arrived. And in that moment, for the first time since the threat began, the Johnson family allowed themselves to breathe just a little. The quiet of the neighborhood shattered with the distant roar of sirens. At first, it sounded like any ordinary emergency, but Mark knew better. He could feel it in his chest, the sound of authority arriving. The U.S. Marshals were on their way. Every heartbeat in the Johnson house seemed louder than the last, echoing through the walls. Mark glanced at Sarah and Emily. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Stay calm, he whispered, trying to keep his own voice steady. They're here to protect us. Outside, the familiar figures of the HOA men had not moved. They were still standing on the street, watching, thinking they had control. But the distant hum of approaching power was about to change everything. The first marshal stepped out of the car, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming in the sunlight. Another followed, scanning the surroundings with trained eyes. They moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that makes bullies hesitate. Mark felt a surge of relief. He didn't need to explain much, the marshals understood immediately. Good afternoon, one marshal called, voice firm but polite. We received a report. We're here to ensure everyone's safety. The HOA men straightened, trying to appear authoritative, but the shift in power was immediate. They had expected fear, resistance, maybe a weak argument. They had not expected law enforcement to appear so quickly. Mark stepped forward. They threatened my daughter. They said they could arrest her for rules she didn't break. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. Emily clung to Sarah's arm, peeking nervously at the scene outside. One of the marshals nodded, signaling his partner to stay alert. We'll handle this, he said. Step aside. The HOA men exchanged nervous glances. The swagger they had carried moments before was gone, replaced by doubt and tension. The rules they thought would give them power suddenly felt meaningless in the face of real authority. Mark watched closely as the marshals approached the men, asking questions, checking identification, and reviewing papers. The HOA men stuttered, tried to argue, but the law was clear, and their threats were now empty. The air was charged with tension, but the balance had shifted, the marshals controlled the scene. Inside the house, Sarah and Emily watched through the blinds. Every word carried weight, every movement outside mattered. The marshals spoke quietly but firmly, leaving no room for argument. For the first time in hours, a sense of safety began to return. Emily's small hand found Mark's again, squeezing it tightly. Mark felt a mix of relief and disbelief. After so much fear and uncertainty, help had finally arrived. But the confrontation was not just about authority, it was about standing up for what was right. The HOA men learned quickly that threats and intimidation had limits. Minutes passed like hours as the marshals continued their work. The HOA men were questioned, warned, and made to understand the seriousness of their actions. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The Johnson family could finally breathe, but the memory of fear lingered, a reminder of how quickly life could change. As the Marshals finished, they turned to Mark and Sarah. "Your family is safe," one said. "We'll make sure they don't come near again." Mark exhaled, a heavy, long breath. Emily smiled faintly, the tension easing from her small shoulders. Sarah hugged her tightly, whispering, "It's over, for now." But Mark knew the lesson would stay with them forever. Sometimes, standing up and asking for help was the only way to protect the people you love. And sometimes, the calm you had before the storm was just a memory. The air outside the Johnson home felt heavier than before, thick with tension. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Mark, Sarah, and Emily watched silently from behind the blinds, hearts pounding. Every second stretched longer than the last. The Marshals had stepped forward, their presence commanding. The HOA men, once full of swagger and menace, now shuffled nervously, unsure of what to do. The clipboard that had seemed so powerful earlier now looked like a fragile piece of paper in their hands. One Marshal's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "You have no right to threaten anyone under these rules," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will leave this property immediately, and you will not return." The HOA men tried to argue, their voices rising, but it was weak, desperate, and filled with fear. The camera of tension shifted, they were no longer in control. The rules they had wielded as a weapon now held no weight against authority and truth. Mark's jaw tightened. He felt a surge of pride and relief. This was the moment he had feared and hoped for at the same time. His daughter, safe inside, could finally breathe, but the confrontation wasn't just about safety, it was about justice. The lead marshal stepped closer to the HOA men, pointing out the consequences of further harassment. "If you continue these threats, there will be legal action. This family has rights, and you have crossed the line." His words were precise, leaving the thugs no room to maneuver. The HOA men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. The confident posture they had carried for weeks now crumbled. They realized their intimidation had failed completely. Their eyes darted nervously toward the house, toward Emily, and for the first time, they seemed small, powerless. Emily peeked around the edge of the curtain, her small eyes wide with awe. She saw her father standing tall, and the Marshals moving with authority. The fear that had gripped her hours before now began to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of security. Sarah exhaled slowly, holding Emily close. "They're scared," she whispered. "They know they can't win." The Marshals continued their calm but firm questioning, checking names, documents, and verifying rules. Every word they spoke was a reminder that true power doesn't come from threats, it comes from truth, law, and courage. Minutes felt like hours, and then it was over. The HOA men, heads down, shuffled back to their cars, muttering angrily but defeated. Their last glances toward the Johnson home carried a mixture of anger and disbelief. They had underestimated the family and the law. Mark turned to the Marshals, gratitude and relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said simply. Words felt small compared to the protection they had received, but they carried everything he felt in that moment. The Marshals nodded. "You did the right thing calling us. Always remember, it's okay to ask for help when someone threatens your family." Inside, Emily hugged her father tightly. "I was so scared," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. Mark kissed her forehead. "I know, baby. But you're safe now. That's what matters." As the HOA men drove away, defeated and humiliated, a quiet settled over the street. The storm had passed, at least for now. But the lesson remained clear: courage, truth, and standing up for what is right were stronger than any threat or intimidation. For the Johnson family, this confrontation was more than just a fight, it was proof that fear could be overcome, that help could arrive when needed, and that no one had the right to harm or threaten those who were innocent. And while the calm returned, the memory of this day, the fear, the threat, and the power of standing up would stay with them forever. The street was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. The laughter of children and the hum of daily life had returned, yet the Johnson family could feel the weight of what had just happened. The HOA men were gone, but their shadow lingered in the corners of the neighborhood, a reminder of how close danger had come. Mark stood on the front porch, watching the tail lights of the departing cars fade down the street. Relief washed over him, but so did exhaustion. His hands rested on the railing, gripping it tightly as if holding on to the moment itself. Sarah joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and Emily clung to both of them, her small head resting against Mark's chest. Inside, the house seemed to breathe again. The air felt lighter, and the tension that had hung like a thick fog began to lift. The walls, which had seemed so confining just hours ago, now felt like a safe space. Every creak of the floor and every whisper of wind no longer carried fear, they carried reassurance. Mark looked at his daughter and smiled. "You're safe now, Emily. No one is going to hurt you," he said. His voice was firm, yet gentle, carrying both authority and comfort. Emily's eyes shone with tears of relief, and she nodded slowly, trusting completely in her father's words. Sarah took a deep breath. "It's over," she said softly, though the memory of the threats still lingered in her mind. For now. The Marshals had left, but their presence had left a permanent mark on the Johnson family. They realized that courage was not just about standing up in the moment, it was about knowing when to ask for help, when to trust others, and when to fight for what is right. Mark looked around the yard, at the flowers Sarah had been watering, at the swings Emily loved to play on. Everything seemed ordinary again, yet it felt precious in a new way. The family had faced fear together, and they had survived. They had learned that safety was fragile, but with action and courage, it could be protected. As the evening sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street, the Johnsons sat together on the porch. They watched the neighborhood, alert yet calm, aware that vigilance would always be part of their lives. The HOA men had been defeated, but the lesson remained: threats could come from the most unexpected places, and courage could come from the most unexpected acts. Emily broke the silence, her voice small but firm. "Daddy, we did the right thing, didn't we?" Mark smiled, holding her close. "Yes, Emily. We did the right thing. We protected each other, and that's what matters most." Sarah leaned against Mark, her face softening as the adrenaline faded. "We'll be okay," she said. "We faced the fear, and we won." For the first time since the threats began, a sense of peace settled over the Johnson home. It was quiet, yes, but it was the quiet of safety, of resilience, and of victory. The storm had passed, and the family could finally breathe, together, knowing they had faced something frightening and had come out stronger. And while the neighborhood returned to its calm routine, the Johnson family would always remember the day when ordinary rules had been twisted into threats, and how courage, action, and help had turned fear into safety. The Johnson home was quiet now, but it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the calm of understanding. The kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed, when hearts are still racing but the danger is gone. Mark sat on the porch with Emily in his lap, Sarah beside them, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The golden light cast long shadows across the yard, making even the familiar swings and flowers feel new, almost magical. Emily broke the silence first. "Daddy, why did they try to hurt me?" "I didn't do anything wrong," she asked, her small voice trembling. Mark held her close, feeling the weight of the question. "Sometimes, people try to control others because it makes them feel powerful," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean we have to be afraid. We stood up, we got help, and we protected ourselves. That's what matters." Sarah nodded, taking Emily's hand. "Fear can feel very strong, but courage doesn't mean you aren't scared. Courage means you act even when you are scared." The family sat quietly for a few moments, letting the lesson sink in. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as if nothing had happened, but for the Johnsons, nothing would ever feel exactly the same. They had seen how fragile peace could be and how quickly ordinary life could turn threatening. Mark thought about the HOA men, their threats, and how powerless the family had felt at first. He realized that fear often grows in silence, in waiting, in the moments when you feel alone. But help, courage, and standing together could turn that fear into strength. Emily leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "I feel safe now," she said softly. "Because you and Mom are with me." "Yes," Mark replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Safety isn't just about rules or locks. It's about family. It's about looking out for each other and asking for help when we need it. Sarah added, and about knowing that even when people try to intimidate you, their power isn't stronger than truth, courage, or love. The sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. The quiet of evening settled over the house, wrapping the family in a sense of peace that was both fragile and precious. They had faced real danger, and they had come through it stronger, wiser, and closer than ever. Mark stood and looked around the yard, at the swings, the flowers, and the small footprints of Emily running through the grass. "We can't control what others do," he said quietly. "But we can control how we respond. That's the real lesson." Emily smiled, understanding more than her young years should allow. "We're brave," she said. "Yes, we are," Mark agreed, pulling both Sarah and Emily close. And in that moment, the Johnson family knew that fear had no place when love, courage, and unity stood strong. The storm had passed. The threats had ended. And while the memory of the ordeal would stay with them forever, so too would the lesson: no one could take away what they had together, and together, they could face anything.